You are now recording. Our interview today is with Michael Nesvacil. Michael was born April of 1952 in Chicago, Illinois. Michael served in both the United States Air Force and the United States Army from June of 1970 until May of 1984. His highest rank attained was Chief Warrant Officer 2, CW2. This interview was conducted at Burleson, Texas on Monday, August the 23rd, 2021. My name is Dale Dexheimer. I am not related to Michael in any way. Also present today is Milton Gibson, our videographer. This interview is conducted for the Veterans History Project in the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and for Operation Remember, the city of Burleson, Texas. And with that little introduction, Michael, you can tell us about your life in the U.S. military. So it's your floor, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to start first by thanking anyone in the future who takes the time to watch this video. I was getting ready to graduate high school, and my father, who was a World War II veteran and had fought in North Africa, Italy, and was wounded at Anzio, asked me what I wanted to do after I got out of high school. And I said, I'd like to go to college. His answer, matter of factly, was, well, how are you going to pay for that, boy? And first time I took some serious stock of my life. And I realized at that point, because my interests in high school had not been grades, they had been girls, cars, and sports, that I was probably not going to get an athletic scholarship. None of the girls I dated had daddies rich enough to pay for me to go to school. So I said, well, I guess I'll go into service and get me one of them GI Bills, to which Dad said, that's a damn fine idea, boy. You need a ride to the recruiter's office? I said, no, sir, I know where it's at. And his last word on the subject was, don't forget to write your mother when you get to boot camp. So I went over to the recruiter, and I actually talked to the Marine Corps recruiter and the Air Force recruiter. And something in my brain said, 2 years is nice, but 4 years where I can maybe learn something is even better. So I enlisted in the Air Force, was guaranteed the job of aircraft maintenance person. And I went to boot camp in San Antonio, left in June of 72, 2 weeks after high school graduation, June of 70, 2 weeks after high school graduation. Did 12 weeks in the wonderful Texas summer, which was a real shock to this Chicago boy. And then I went to Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, for my advanced training. And that was also 12, 14 weeks, which was another shock because I never realized how much it could rain in one place. Come November, it rained so hard, the water was running in the streets when we were marching from the barracks to the school hangar or back to the barracks at the end of the day, that it was actually up above. You couldn't see the curbs in the street. That's how high the water was, and it was flowing. And I'm going, this is nothing like I've ever seen before. So, but I did learn aircraft maintenance, and I was a little surprised when I got stationed at my first permanent assignment after tech school. We had trained on nothing but fighter aircraft, F-4s, F-111s, F-105s, and they sent me to a maintenance squadron at Grissom Air Force Base, just north of Indianapolis in Peru, Indiana, and it was a KC-135 squadron, Boeing 707 that was modified for the Air Force use to refuel other aircraft in flight, B-52s, fighter aircraft. And I said, I was a little disappointed when I showed up and figured that out, but I said, okay, it's where I am, so let's make the best of it. as time went on, I was quite pleased that that had happened to me, because the tankers went all over the world on temporary duty assignments. And as I progressed in rank and was actually assigned a specific aircraft, that when I became a sergeant, E4 in the Air Force, I was the maintenance crew chief. Everything that happened mechanically wise on that aircraft, I either did it or I knew about it and signed off on it. And when that aircraft traveled, I traveled with it to provide maintenance at distant sites other than the home base. So it was quite the experience. And then I figured, maybe I could get a job at O'Hare Airport when I get discharged instead of going to school, because I enjoyed the aircraft maintenance so much. And so I did go with the tanker over to Utapao Royal Thai Naval Airfield, if it's its full name, 90 kilometers away from Bangkok, and we flew tanker missions refueling Air Force and Navy F-4s over North Vietnam so that they could get back to their ship or their ground base in South Vietnam. When they launched, they only had enough fuel to basically go do the mission and then catch up with us, and then we would refuel them so they could go back. And our day consisted of, I'd either work a 12-hour shift on the flight line, working on aircraft that needed work, or if I was flying that day, we would take off and go over the north and refuel 9 F-4s, 3 at a time, in sets of 3. We'd have one on the boom and one on each wing tip, providing coverage for us. And then they would break off and 3 more would show up, and then 3 more would show up. And then the pilots referred to it as calling bingo. They had just had enough fuel for us to get back home. So we'd land, I'd refuel the aircraft, and take off again and do 3 more sets. And we did that 3 times in a 12-hour shift. I really enjoyed the weather over there. It was very tropical. But then the monsoon showed up, and it was like, I was so amazed. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, set your watch to it, it started raining. And it's like every day. But I felt like we were doing something that was important to our country. We were, fighting this conflict, and so that was the highlight of my Air Force career. I did go other places. I took my tanker quite a bit to an air base in Labrador, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada, just south of the Arctic Circle, an air base named Goose Bay. And our mission there was to sit on alert status, which we lived in a barracks that was, half of it was underground. And if war started, we were the first birds launched. And it was our job to to meet the B-52s that flew over the Arctic, bombed Russia, and refuel them so they could get back to U.S. bases. Fortunately, that never happened. But it was fun. I enjoyed it was kind of like Canadian wilderness. There wasn't much around there. But it was fun and pretty country, and I enjoyed that. Again, another shock, though. I was used to snow, but not like in Goose Bay. I was up there, the first October I was up there, the weather forecasters said on Friday afternoon that a snow front was going to come in overnight, and that there would maybe be 2 to 4 inches of accumulation overnight. And I said, well, Chicago boy, 2-4 inches? Nah, no problem. Well, Monday morning when it stopped snowing, there was 42 inches on the ground. So yeah, that was a bit of a shock to me. But all in all, that was a nice assignment too. I liked traveling up to Goose. Oh, my old man liked it too, because I could buy him a 5th of Crown Royal in the Class 6 supply store, which was alcohol in the military, Class 6 of supply, for I think it was $3, and bring it home duty free. And yeah, that was Henry like that, my old man. So, but time went on, and I, at about 2.5 years of service, I asked for an early release from my 4-year enlistment, and Vietnam was winding down, and they said, "Sure, go away. We can do a reduction in force." And I told, I said, "Okay, and this is good. I'm going to go back to O'Hare, and I'm going to get a job at United Airlines as a mechanic." Well, I got back just in time for the recession of '72. Had a neighbor 3 houses down from my parents, real great young man. He was probably in his early 30s, but he was an Air Force veteran like I was, and worked for United as a mechanic. And I went and asked Bill if he knew anybody that could help me find a job or get a job at United. And he looked at me and said, "I don't even know anybody that can help me save my job." Things were that terrible. So I stumbled around, did some dead-end jobs for a while. The last one that I did, I was working for a recycle company. They built these, and I actually built them, these large wooden crates that they were wooden framed and then had chicken wire stapled on the inside that companies would throw their office paper in. And then we also had contracts to take a small truck and pick them up and drop off empty ones. And I worked there for 2 weeks, either working the night shift building crates or taking the truck into Chicago and picking up the full ones. And got my first 2-week paycheck, deposited it in the bank, and it bounced. One of the 2 partners that had started this company cleaned the company bank account out and disappeared. So I had to, go home and tell my wife, and by this time I had a wife and a baby, that what had happened, and it wasn't pleasant. So we discussed it, and I said, the Air Force wasn't so bad after all, and their paychecks didn't bounce. So I went over to the recruiter and asked about re-enlisting. And his answer was, "No, we don't have time for prior service people. If you quit on us once, goodbye." And I'm like, I was so sure I was going to walk out of there with a go back on active duty date. So I stood out in the hall. This was a small office complex where at this one end of the hallway, each service had their own recruiting office separate. They weren't all in one room. So I'm standing out in the hall, actually just scratching my head, wondering, what am I going to do now? And the Army recruiter looked up from his desk and said, "Come here, have I got a deal for you?" So I went and talked to him and told him what I'd done in the Air Force. He said, "Oh yeah, we can use you." And he sweetened the pot by saying, "And we'll even let you start off as an E2 instead of E1. I said, "Oh, great." So I enlisted in the Army, went home, told my wife, and I'm not sure, it wasn't long, maybe a week later, I was off to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri for retraining, basic training. And the nice thing about it was the company was made up of all prior service people. We had Navy people, Air Force people, other Army people, I think maybe even a Coast Guard guy. But it was all guys who had been on active duty before. And the drill sergeants treated us like that. It wasn't as bad as the first boot camp. So I went through boot camp at Fort Leonard Wood and then was sent to oh wow, I'm having a brain cramp. Oh, Fort Gordon, Georgia, for radio operator school. I ended up with the job of infantry backpack radio operator. Even had to learn Morse code, which was fun in and of itself. It's like Morse code, but I did it, and was assigned permanent party to after tech school AIT at Fort Gordon. I went up to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and was assigned to a combat engineer battalion. And that was just, pretty much go home every night to the wife and daughter, and go back to the company area the next day, and the sergeant would have us do things, clean equipment. We went on a lot of field training exercises, but nothing too strenuous. I got to see things that interested me. We used to go down to Camp AP Hill in Virginia for our field training exercises, which was real close to the Manassas Bull Run battlefield, and I've always been interested in the Civil War, and so I enjoyed being in that part of the country. Got to go see Mount Vernon. Did a lot of driving around Washington, D.C. playing tourist. In fact, my apartment became the family vacation spot. My brother and his family, other family would show up, and of course, Michael had to drive him around D.C. Now, I was a, as my wife calls it now, persnickety person even back then. I told everybody, and I won't, being the good Catholic kid that I was raised as, we'll probably have to spend time in purgatory for this. But everybody I took on the tour driving around D.C., I'd point out the Washington Monument to them and say, you see where the stone changes color? And it does, about a third of the way up. And that's because they stopped construction during the Civil War and then used stone from a different quarry to finish the project. But I would tell people, that's the high water mark of the Great Washington Flood of 1872. And nobody ever questioned it. So that was fun. From there, I went to a NATO support group. I was a communications sergeant and controlled the communication security codes for a field artillery detachment in northern Greece. We supported a Greek army artillery battalion. It was kind of wasn't such a great place to live, but I'm sure there were worse places. But I did bring my wife and daughter over on my own, and we lived on the economy, and I bought a car, and the thing that amazed me was that the headquarters was down in Athens for the detachment, for the unit, and we had 4 detachments across northern Greece. And ours was in a town outside of a town named Kilkis that was 8 miles or 8 kilometers south of the Bulgarian-Greek border. And because there had been a war back in the 1800s between Greece and Bulgaria, and the Greeks had won the war decisively, they always considered the Bulgarians, they referred to it as their juniors in English. And so they would take their 8-inch cannon out of the caserne, turn north for live fire practice, and use southern Bulgaria for their impact zone, daring the Bulgarians to do anything about it. And that was quite an interesting year, but I survived and came home and went to Fort Gordon, Georgia as permanent party. By that time, I got promoted to E6 Staff Sergeant and was working for the ComSec, Communications Security, Warrant Officer for the battalion. Larry Miller was a Chief Warrant Officer, and in the Army, the Warrant Officer rank system is you're a separate rank. There was W1, then CW2, Chief Warrant Officer 2, 3, and 4, and those 4 grades were outranked all the enlisted personnel, but were junior to all commissioned officers. And the warrant officer system was such that a commissioned officer in the Army had a branch. He was trained in either artillery, infantry, signal corps. He had a specific branch that was his major training, and every other assignment was in that branch as a signal corps infantry officer. But those off assignments were indifferent. So if he was a Signal Corps officer, one time he'd work in an infantry company, Signal Corps, go work in an artillery company, back to Signal Corps. And the theory was that by the time if he ever made general officer, he had worked in all the different branches and knew how to supervise them. But a warrant officer never did this, never changed jobs. No matter where we were assigned, we did our one specialty. Wherever I went, I was in charge of communication security for the unit, whether it was a battalion or a brigade or a division. There were warrant officers who ran the motor pool. Warrant officers ran the mess hall. Warrant officers were physician's assistants in the hospitals. Warrant officers were pilots. They flew the helicopters. And the inside joke was those of us that weren't pilots, all of the other specialties, we referred to ourselves as RWOs, real warrant officers. But it was all in good fun. Because I did have at Fort Hood, I had 2 assignments I was the brigade ComSec officer for the 6th Cavalry Brigade, which was a independent, it wasn't assigned to any division. It was independent attack helicopter, two units of battalions of attack helicopters. And then after an overseas assignment in Turkey, I came back to Fort Hood and was the 1st Cavalry Division's communications security officer. So I liked Fort Hood. It's where I decided to become a Texan and never own a snow shovel again. And part of it too was monetary. My time at 6th Cavalry Brigade, the first time at Fort Hood, something happened and Department of the Army was ordered by Congress that if a soldier's home of record was a state that collected state income tax, the Army had to start taking state income tax out of our military pay and sending it to that state, whether we live there or not. So they were getting ready to take money out of my check and send it to Springfield, Illinois, even though I hadn't been in Illinois in years. The good news was the Army sent out a form and said, "What's your home of record? Where do you live?" And because I owned a house in Copperas Cove, Texas, outside of Fort Hood, I said, "I'm a Texan." I also call it a Texan, but I'm a Texan because there's no state income tax here. I enjoyed my time overseas. I enjoyed the communication security work that I did. I had a very high level special intelligence clearance. When I was overseas, I was the OIC of what is in the media genre, the movies and books referred to as black comm centers. They were listening posts. We listened to foreign government communication and send all that traffic back to the NSA at Fort Meade. I really enjoyed the job, and I came home from my time in Turkey, and my daughters were, I think the oldest one had turned 13, and so the younger one was 11. My wife said, "Is there anything else you can do for a living?" Girls have kind of like, "I need some help raising your daughters." And I said, "Well, sure, I guess." I struggled with it, but in the end I decided family comes first, because what I struggled with was on my way home from the assignment in Turkey, I was asked, and I was going back, Fort Hood had become my home base. The Army had started this nice program of home basing. It was something like the British regimental system, but not as cohesive. It meant that I declared Fort Hood my home base, so wherever I went to on an assignment, whether with my wife or without my wife, I would always come back to Fort Hood when I returned to the United States. So that I was trying to give my wife some stability. She was educated. She had a college degree and was a kindergarten teacher in the school district. One of the nice things that happened to me too, I completely forgot about this for a second or two. When I left 6th Cavalry Brigade, I was originally on orders to go to Busan, Korea for a year. And a month before my date of departure, my phone rings in my office, and I picked up the phone, and I even forget the guy's name, but he said, "This is so-and-so." And I said, "Okay, what can I do for you?" He said, "Well, I just took so-and-so's place." And I said, "Oh, now that name I recognize. He was the W4 in the Pentagon that assigned all the other ComSec warrants everywhere in the Army." And I said, "What can I do for you?" He said, "You got the next ticket to Korea, DROS, to Korea, and I promised a good buddy of mine I'd get him to Korea as soon as I could when I got up here. What do you want to give up that assignment?" And I'm going, I've just won the lottery. So the deal was, I gave up that slot, and a couple of months later, when a new school semester started, I was assigned to the student detachment at Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana, with a duty station of Central Texas College, to earn an associate degree in computer science on the Army's nickel. So yeah, that worked out great. But then after I finished the degree, it was time to pay the piper, so I had to go on another short tour to Turkey for the year. But when that was over and I came back to Fort Hood, I was asked if I wanted to join the White House Communications Agency and provide communications support for the president, the vice president, and cabinet members when they traveled. And when I wasn't on the road with them, I would be the duty officer, the OIC of the President's Communications Center in the basement of the White House. Do that on a rotating shift with the other ComSec warrants that were assigned to WACA. And now that job I really wanted. So when my wife asked me about separating, it was like there was some, oh, do I really want to give this job up? But in the end, family came first, and I was, as a warrant officer, I was classified by the Army as a reserve warrant officer on active duty. I wasn't a regular Army, an RA officer, like the graduates from West Point. So as a reserve warrant officer, I had more than enough time on active duty. I could submit a letter of resignation at any time I wanted to Department of the Army, and they would set a separation date for me, and it would just be like giving notice to a civilian job. So I did that, and discharged from the Army in May of '84. And I have no regrets, again, because family came first, and I enjoyed everything I ever did in the military. And I think back on it now, even boot camp, because I didn't have to think. I had a drill sergeant telling me what to do, when to do it, how to do it, every minute of the day. And when they weren't doing that, I was in my bunk sleeping. So I enjoyed the military and would have gladly made a career out of it for 20 years if family situations hadn't dictated different. But I'm very proud of all my service time and what I accomplished. How we doing?
It's your show.
Well, that's what I'm saying is, how many minutes are left?
You're doing fine.
Okay, all right. But I'm about at the end of all I can think of off the top of my head. If you have any questions that could jog my memory.
Good interview, Michael.
Okay.
But I do have some questions.
Sure.
You got married when you were in the Air Force?
Yes.
And you have 2 kids?
2 daughters, yes.
2 daughters, okay. And somewhere along the line, you took Mom and the girls to Greece?
Yes.
Lived off base?
Yes. On the economy, as it was referred to.
What were their thoughts about that whole thing?
The girls were too little to know. Kelly, the younger one, was just an infant. And so Danielle was maybe 3 and Kelly was maybe 1. So the only thing that I remember about Danielle specifically Well, no, there's a couple of things now that are jumping back. But one of the things that was nice about this time, you could buy things from the overseas PX system. So I bought ourselves a very nice stereo system. And then I bought Elton John's album that had the song Daniel on it, talking about his brother who went blind. But my daughter Danielle, at 3, thought he was singing about Danielle, not Daniel. So she always wanted me to put her song on. And then, you know, babies are precious to the Greeks more so. It's the landlady that we lived above. Every day she would come upstairs and want to watch Danielle for a while, bring her downstairs and put her in a high chair and put a bowl of milk with sugar dissolved in it and dip bread in it and feed it to her. And the bread was good. It was like in Turkey, it was baked fresh every day. There was no such thing as preservatives in bread, and it sat on the shelf for a while. There was once a week there was a farmer's market, and that's when Genevieve and I would go shopping and get our groceries for the week.
How long were you in country with the family?
With the family, probably about 10 months. I got over there, got settled. A couple other guys had their families there. And so I sent Genevieve a letter and talked to her about it, and she said, yes, let's, bring us over.
But you were in country, but not at a U.S. military base a la Fort Hood or
Correct.
anything. You had no base exchange.
Oh, we did.
Oh, you did?
Yes, there was again, the headquarters detachment was down in Athens, and each of these 4 spread out detachments had their own small, think of a Quonset hut turned into a little PX.
Okay.
And the mess sergeant was also the PX sergeant. And he was also the NCO club sergeant. He ordered all the liquor and brought it in and got guys to take shifts during the evenings and on weekends doing beer tending, and he opened the commissary, the PX, for a couple hours every day. So we did have some, and he was the one where I would use the catalog and I would go in and I'd fill out the form and say, I want this stereo system, and here's a check off a U.S. bank, and he would mail it off somewhere and it would show up. But we did live on the economy, and we were actually assigned to a Greek army concern of field artillery battalions. But we had our own small compound off to one corner of the concern.
Greece, excuse me, Greece is the only offshore facility where the family went. You didn't take them to Turkey?
No, Turkey, the living conditions were not such that I would have put my family in that city.
Okay.
It was, I don't want to sound snooty about it, but it was okay for the Turks who were used to it, but it's not a place where I would have felt comfortable with my family.
Let me jump to Vietnam service. Based at Utapao, and you did fly. You had flight time in a KC-135.
Yes.
Where do they put the crew chief when he gets on that KC-135? Is there a specific little cubby hole that they stuff you in, or?
No, there's the cockpit is pilot, co-pilot, left, right seats. Behind the co-pilot is a navigator station, and he had an actual desk that he sat at. And then directly behind the pilot was the scuttle hole that we climbed up and down a straight ladder to get into the cockpit. And then behind that was the boom operator's station, and he sat there, during takeoff and landing. I strapped myself in. This was a KC cargo, so it could carry 144,000 pounds of JP4 in its wing tanks and underbody tanks, because everywhere on a civilian Boeing 707 that would carry luggage was a fuel tank on a KC-135. But we had a big, large open deck with jump seats running down the side, and I would just strap myself into one of the jump seats. And there were also 2 bunks in the back cargo area for long missions where I had priority for one of the bunks because I was the one who had to work when we landed. But the other one was there for, the boom operator or the navigator or somebody else who wanted to take a nap during the
Could
long
you
supplies.
actually sleep
I did.
on that thing?
I did, yes.
Wasn't it a little noisy?
No noisier than a civilian
Really?
aircraft. Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
the insulation was quite good.
Okay.
Oh, I remember one time too. I actually have experienced weightlessness. Have you ever heard of the vomit comet?
No, I haven't.
It's a KC-135 that the NASA used that was fully, super padded, and they would take the astronauts up in it in a bell curve. The pilot would do a very steep bell curve, and on that downward swing, you experience weightlessness. And I've seen pictures on the internet of the astronaut trainees floating around. Well, we were flying somewhere over the north, and the pilot said, I got to get out of here now. And he went into a steep dive, and I was walking from the front of the cargo compartment to the back, and I started floating because of the incline of his dive to get away from whatever it was he saw that he didn't like. So, yeah, I'd forgotten about that too. That was fun.
Where am I here? Let's see here. When you enlisted in the Army, and they had a mixed company at Fort Leonard Wood.
Right.
You had Navy, Army, Air Force, etc. How many guys do you have in a company like that?
30.
Oh, just 30?
Yes.
30 was the entire boot camp, modified boot camp.
Well, it's company element size.
Okay.
Now, a normal infantry company is more people.
Right.
But for boot camp, no, it's one drill sergeant has 30 boots that he pushes. So.
Okay. Going back to some overseas service, you worked with the Greeks.
Yes.
What do you think about the Greek army?
Not much.
What do you think about the Turks?
A lot more. The Greeks just seemed very laid back, and it was at a time that they still practice the custom, and I don't know if they do or not to this day, but when I was living in Greece, they practiced the custom of siesta. They would shut down, they would have a big lunch and shut down and go home and take a nap and reopen their shops at 4 p.m. and then stay open later. So, and so the whole army did that too. The Greek soldiers that we were supposed to be training, would go have their lunch in the mess hall and then go back to the barracks till 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we were ending our workday. And it just seemed rather...
Turks were not that way.
No, they were a professional army.
You mentioned you were actually a reserve warrant officer. Do I have that right?
Yes.
So you were an RCW.
No. I was a chief warrant officer. That was the only title for my grade. Reserve officer just meant and I don't know about the other branches. In the Army, you have one of 2 statuses. You're either regular Army, RA, or you're reserve on active duty. And so that's when I was an NCO before I became warrant, I was RA.
Okay.
So I actually have.
That's the question I had.
Yeah.
So you were reserve all through your time in the Army?
No. I was regular Army enlisted.
Okay.
And I have a DD-214 that discharged Staff Sergeant Nesvacil from the regular Army and a set of orders for a concurrent call to active duty as a reserve warrant officer the next day.
Okay. So we're at the end of your active duty. You do any reserve time? You sign with a unit when you get out?
No, I just separated.
You ever have some second thoughts about that one?
Oh yes, yes.
That 20 years was 9 years away, and
yes. Well, and again, in the reserves, it would have been. You don't draw out of retirement until you turn 62, if you put in time in the reserves. But it still would have been something after I turned 62. But at the time, it's like I'm in my early 30s, and I'm going, I'm not going to fool around with this till I'm 62. So that was.
I think we had a good interview, Michael.
All right, thank you.
We appreciate your time, sir. Appreciate your service.
I appreciate you guys doing this, and I'm hopeful that someday my great-grandchildren might watch this. If nobody else.
They'll be impressed. Thank you, sir.